Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Bijan, host of COWTOWN Movie Classics. And tonight we are doing something a little bit spooky for the holidays by showing one of my favorite Christmas horror classics. From AMICUS Productions in 1972, it's the original feature film version of Tales from the Crypt. Joining us tonight is prolific author, film historian, and British Gothic expert, Mr. Jonathan Rigby. How are you doing tonight, Jonathan?
Hello there, Ryan. I'm doing well tonight and very delighted to talk about this film.
As mentioned earlier, Tales from the Crypt was from Amicus Productions, which, if you're like me and you're a fan of the British horror films of the 60s and 70s, Amicus is right up there with Hammer Films, which our audience at this point must be very familiar with. So, Jonathan, what was the Amicus house style and what set them apart from their competitors at Hammer?
Well, Amicus, curiously enough, was a very British company, and yet it was run by a couple of American guys. Max J. Rosenberg, who stayed back in New York City doing the deals, and Milton Subotsky, who was, if you like, the artistic director. And he moved to England and became an enormous Anglophile, actually. He loved Britain and the British, and I think that comes through very strongly in Amicus films. But they are very different from Hammer films. Generally speaking, you can put it this simply, they didn't make films set in the Gothic past. Their films may have been Gothic, but they were always set in very contemporary settings. And, there are plenty of people who actually think, maybe you could argue they're scarier than Hammer films tended to be for that reason. Because, they were set in a very familiar reality. They were rooted in Britain of the 60s and 70s. So that's the basic difference. Milton Subotsky had a complicated relationship with Hammer because in 1956 he'd written a script called Frankenstein and the Monster, which was actually sent to Hammer Films with the recommendation that they make a Frankenstein film. However, they thought this was a great idea, but they thought the script was appalling. So they went ahead and made a Frankenstein film, but didn't use Subotsky's script. And of course, that was the curse of Frankenstein, and the whole British horror boom surged up from that point. And I think Subotsky felt a bit cheesed off about that because he'd sort of been involved in the inception of it, but had been marginalized very quickly. So he was quite snippy about Hammer films. But one thing he particularly disliked about Hammer films, he felt that they were needlessly gruesome, sort of mindlessly gruesome. And he was very careful with his Amicus films to avoid all that. Well, that may have been his intention, but when you watch this particular film coming up, Tales from the Crypt, bear in mind that there are a few extremely gruesome moments in it that Hammer would have been proud of. So Subotsky's response to Hammer films was kind of confused, but nevertheless, with Rosenberg, they carved out a type of British horror which often used Hammer's stars and quite often their directors and some of their personnel, but nevertheless was very, very different. So, it's lovely to sort of have them sitting beside each other. There's no need to prefer one or the other. They coexist rather beautifully.
No, I absolutely agree. One thing that's kind of interesting about the Amicus films, especially the film we're going to watch tonight, is they specialized in what, as Americans, we would know as the anthology horror film. But I
Hmm.
understand in the UK, they're more commonly known as the portmanteau type of film.
Yes, anthology, portmanteau, whichever you prefer. Yeah.
Sure. So, what appealed to Sabatsky and Rosenberg? What was it about the short story format that they felt made their horror films a little more unique?
Well, Subotsky had a kind of conversion. He'd had a remarkable sort of almost religious experience in the late 40s when he saw an Ealing film, again a British film, called Dead of Night, which was really the classic sort of just post-war
Yeah.
portmanteau horror film. And he was bowled over by Dead of Night. And also at the time, he was doing some interesting things. He was writing horror stories for the TV series Lights Out, and he was editing old westerns into time slots for television presentation, which meant he was cutting out all the flab. So this, coupled with his fascination for Dead of Night, made him very keen on telling short stories. And of course, the Dead of Night format made him think, well, of course, there's no money in making actual shorts. So what we'll do is we'll create shorts that sort of cohere and have got a framework. And there you are. You've got your portmanteau film. So that very much became the Amicus speciality. And in 1964, they made the first one, which was Dr. Terror's House of Horrors. And there are going to be several more down the line.
Tonight's film is based on a very controversial series of comic books, American comic books from EC Comics in the 1950s. Obviously, the basis of tonight's film. The title comes from one of their series, Tales from the Crypt. They had several other concurrent series, The Haunt of Fear, The Vault of Horror, crime suspense stories, all these very lurid hot boiler types of subject matter. And as a comic book fan, these stories are still fun to read today, and they're still shockingly gruesome even by today's standards.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that was a real inspiration on Sabotsky's part because, of course, back in the 50s, he'd been in America. He hadn't yet emigrated to England, and he obviously was very conscious of these EC comics, and he was obviously very conscious too of the controversy that you mentioned. You know, Frederick Wortham wrote a very anti book called Seduction of the Innocent because, of course, these comics were perceived as being aimed at children. William M. Gaines was the editor and the co-writer of a lot of these very gruesome stories, and he went up in front of a Senate subcommittee to testify about the effect of this stuff on children. And indeed, EC, this particular line anyway, was pretty smartly closed down. So Tales from the Crypt and the Vault of Horror, and as you say, the Haunt of Fear and all the rest, they occupy a very special place. And Subotsky was obviously very aware of that. And to decide to make movies of some of the stories was a stroke of genius, really. And of course, the year after Tales from the Crypt, they do another one, Vault of Horror, in fact, the Vault of Horror. But the fascinating thing is that this American source material is being adapted by an American, but transplanted absolutely lock, stock, and barrel to Britain in the early 70s. They've got American source material, and they're such extremely British films. I think that's one of the most fascinating things about them.
This really is a pioneering, trailblazing film because not only do we have that wonderful opening scene with the killer Santa Claus, we later on have a Valentine's Day themed horror story, which is quite tragic and still very effective. But when you really think about it, the film came out in 1972. This movie predates Black Christmas, My Bloody Valentine, and of course, John Carpenter's Halloween, which was not released until 1978.
Right, I know. Well, of course, flowing from this film, starting with Black Christmas, as you say, there are going to be a whole ton of Christmas-themed horror films, very often featuring Santa Claus, as this one does. And yes, the whole Valentine's Day thing, starting with Halloween, there's going to be so many slashers that take, sort of red letter days as their title, Friday the 13th, Graduation Day, April Fool's Day, on and on and on. So, yes, in a funny kind of way, the film was influential on two major subgenres, the Christmas horror movie, which is quite a big subgenre, actually, and of course the slasher subgenre, which is enormous, as we know. So, yes, you wouldn't expect it from a modest little British film like this, but that's very true.
So, if we had to sum it up, what does our audience have to look forward to in the next 90 minutes or so?
What you have to look forward to is 5 fascinating stories, some very distinguished actors. This was an interesting moment in the British film industry because basically it was collapsing. And so a lot of very distinguished actors were happy to do whatever came along. So here you've got Ralph Richardson as the Crypt Keeper, not remotely like the Crypt Keeper of the comics, but we don't mind because it's Ralph Richardson with that penetrating stare of his. And you can, yes, I think they've got some excellent stories that you can really relish.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much. If you're in our audience, please stick around after the film so you can hear the rest of our conversation. Directed by the legendary Freddie Francis from 1972, Tales from the Crypt. Wow, that movie's a lot of fun.
In a kind of gruesome, terrible retribution kind of way. Yeah.
But that's why we love it, right?
Yes. Well, the Amicus films, obviously, because they're in the short format, all the stories, they're like little anecdotes, but I think actually they're a bit more than anecdotes. Of course, they're like little morality tales.
Yes, yeah.
Quite brutal, quite judgmental morality tales very often. But beyond that, they're like little fables. So, if you're looking for, completely naturalistic characterization, whether in the script or in the acting, you've come to the wrong place because they are like little fables. Hammer liked to think that their horror films were fairy tales for adults. And in a way, here you've got Milton Subotsky of Amicus playing with the same idea because they are like little fables.
We've mentioned the other portmanteau films that Amicus did. Where do you rank Tales from the Crypt within this series?
I rank it quite high, actually. It was much the most successful, and Subotsky and Rosenberg were trying to work out why, and they never quite worked out why it was the most successful. I think it sort of tapped a nerve in audiences in 1972. Because it was a slightly old-fashioned film in a way, even for 1972, because the modes of storytelling are very on the nose. In and all through the house, the Christmas story. We get some wonderful exposition when literally a radio announcer just says, "Oh, by the way, there's a homicidal maniac at large," and he's dressed as Santa Claus. Now, I don't think any modern screenwriter would do something quite as, kind of set up and, boxed in and expositional as that. But that's the charm of it, I think. And it was, for its day, quite gruesome. And also, like a lot of British horror films, and we may go on to discuss this further, it's actually very anti-establishment. I think for young audiences in 1972, they saw various nasty right-wing people getting their just desserts. It's actually, I think it's actually rather a left-wing film. And I think that may be what appealed to youth audiences. For instance, I'm now Joan Collins in the first story. Now, because it's just a tiny little story, we don't get any real insight into her. I mean, maybe she has good reason to kill her husband. Maybe her husband is horrible, although judging by what we see, I can't really support that argument. Basically, in the context of a fable, you just have to take it as read. She is a classic bourgeois monster. And also she's in a classic bourgeois setting. I mean, one of the horrors of these Amicus films, if you like, is Tony Curtis's, not the Tony Curtis, the art director Tony Curtis, his wonderfully detailed set designs, which are, the film was shot actually in autumn of 1971, and it just screams that period, particularly Joan Collins's environment. So she's a kind of bourgeois monster. We then encounter Ian Hendry, who is leaving his wife. He seems to be punished the most severely for something. Again, because it's a very short story, we don't know why he's leaving his wife. We don't know how. We can see he's very torn. He seems to have the most unjust punishment. We then get a character, James, the guy who lives across from the dustman, played by Peter Cushing. James, who's played by Robin Phillips. I call him young conservative. Yeah. And then at the opposite end of the film, we'll get old Tory, who's Major Rogers. But in between those, we get Richard Green. We don't find out very much about Richard Green as the businessman who comes back with the not formaldehyde. What is it? It's in his veins.
Embalming fluid, yeah, whatever.
Embalming fluid, that's it. Yeah. We don't hear much about him, but we do hear that he's an extremely ruthless businessman, and his wife lets slip the fact that he's been selling arms. In foreign, because they've been all around the world appropriating antiques from all over the world, and so you get the impression that he's been selling arms probably to ruthless dictators of foreign governments. So they're all, apart from the Ian Hendry one in story 2, the victims, if you like, are all absolutely horrible. And I think there is a little bit of a political sort of leaning in the film. And that makes sense because William Gaines, who ran EC Comics, was himself quite left-leaning. And so, the source material comes through in that. But Milton Subotsky, who wrote the screenplay, as I said earlier, is such an Anglophile. He's taken these American stories and put them into commuter belt home counties England, Surrey and Berkshire and Buckinghamshire. And, I was brought up in exactly that area in exactly that time in the early 70s, and it is so nostalgic. It is so redolent of that time and place. And Subotsky, and yet Subotsky was an American, but he caught it perfectly.
Absolutely. And you read these stories, you watch these films, obviously you go into it expecting it to be quite chilling and gruesome, and a lot of these stories certainly are, but especially this film version, I'm moved at how heartbreaking and sympathetic, especially, of course, I always think about the tale of Arthur Grimsdyke, played by Peter Cushing. That always breaks my heart.
Well, Cushing had very recently lost his wife, and horror fans don't need reminding that he was destroyed by this loss. And he brings a lot of that emotion into this performance. Indeed, he brought a lot of that emotion into a lot of his performances after his wife's death. His acting became suddenly much more sort of naked, emotionally naked. And you see that in Grimsdyke. I mean, theoretically, Grimsdyke is a preposterous figure. If anybody other than Peter Cushing was wearing fingerless mittens and a little cloth cap and it's a little bobble cap and and a waistcoat and a fob watch, and he's a ridiculous figure on one level, but because Peter Cushing puts so much heart into it, and he has that terrible scene where he's reading those atrocious Valentine cards, and his lip starts to vibrate, and his eyes start to mist up, and it is enormously moving. But again, you see, he is a dustman for the council, and the horrible young conservative across the road wants to get him out. And so they go to the leader of the council, and the leader of the council says, "Oh, but look, it's 2 years before his retirement. He'll lose his pension." And they just say, but it'll be a very good saving for the council, whereupon the chief of the council kind of goes, "Oh, well." And so it's an absolutely hideous story of the victimization of somebody who spoils the neighborhood. And then, of course, you've got Major Rogers, who runs the Home for the Blind, and in many ways, all those poor blind men, who are made to appear rather spectral, but they're also enormously human. Those blind men are the kind of Arthur Grimsdyke sort of en masse in that final story. And Major Rogers, is a former military man, and he feeds himself and even his dog better than he does the blind men in his charge. And in Britain here, you probably have parallels in America, but there's been in the last decade or so, there's been from the current government, there's been a big austerity narrative. Not necessarily a true austerity narrative, to do with cuts, particularly for homes, homes for disabled people, for example. And, this austerity narrative is something that I think Major Rogers could get behind if he was still with us. But because we are in the lovely fable land of Amicus, something happens to the horrible, ghastly martinet Major Rogers that unfortunately never happens in real life. He gets eaten by his own dog. Yeah. Isn't that marvelous? Wouldn't we like to see that happen more often in real life?
Oh, certainly. But I think it's fascinating about the film, and you're certainly reminding me with this discussion that ultimately it is a morality play, and there is some kind of supernatural intervention overall. At the end of the day, all these villains end up in hell, as we find out from the closing scene. But can we talk a little bit about what is the British tradition of supernatural holiday stories? I mean, of course, when we think of the most famous one of all, we have Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, which is a ghost story, a morality play set during the holidays.
Absolutely. Well, particularly in the UK, Christmas has always been a time for sitting around the fireside and relating ghost stories. And of course, Dickens was particularly, sensitive to that, and to a large degree he created a genre because he tapped into that so acutely. So yes, you've got A Christmas Carol and its multiple manifestations, but where a killer Santa Claus is concerned, I think Tales from the Crypt was in ahead of the pack, because there are going to be quite a few coming down the pike, but Tales from the Crypt, I think, was the first. But yes, there is that British tradition, and but really the Amicus films, because they're little short stories all strung together, they very much trade on the general sort of stories related around a campfire thing. It's not necessarily a seasonal thing, but although it's very nice when it is, it's just stuff that just to spook your listeners. And I think that the way that's transplanted to 1970s, early 70s Surrey, it's all kind of around Shepperton Studios, which is where Amicus were located. The way that's done, I think, is really rather brilliant. And of course, they picked up from Hammer, they picked up an Oscar-winning cinematographer who was also, had also started to direct films. He found himself slightly stuck in the horror genre, and just directly after Tales from the Crypt, this is Freddie Francis we're talking about. Directly after Tales from the Crypt, he'd make a film called The Creeping Flesh with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. Very good film. But directly after that film, he seemed his sort of discontentment with being stuck in horror films suddenly got to him. And so I think Tales from the Crypt and The Creeping Flesh is really the kind of Freddie Francis high point, is the zenith. And after that, he loses interest, I'm afraid. And he pretty much said so in interviews. But Subotsky and Rosenberg of Amicus were lucky to get him, I think. He just had a real flair for doing these things. And of course, he had, in particular, a visual flair. And very often that was his main interest in making these films, was just to exercise that visual flair. But you still end up with very worthwhile, very entertaining films.
Oh yes, no, I agree absolutely. Of course, as a Hammer horror fan, I know Freddie Francis best as the director of The Evil of Frankenstein, Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. But for our audience who may not be familiar with the name, this was a man who started off as a cameraman for Powell and Pressburger in the early days, and he would go on to be the Academy Award nominated director of photography for David Lynch's The Elephant Man. And he would even collaborate with Martin Scorsese. So he had quite a bit of longevity in his field.
Well, he actually won an Oscar or two as well.
I believe, yes, yes.
I think yes, indeed, yes, he did. Yeah, well, he was enormously distinguished in that field. So to a degree, I suppose what you can understand the way he may have found it a little galling to be stuck in horror movies whenever he was asked to direct films. But he did that very well. And Dracula Has Risen from the Grave is one of the most visually rich of all Hammer's Gothic films. He also worked, of course, he worked marvelously in black and white, of course, films like The Innocents,
Yes.
story from 10 years before Tales from the Crypt. But he did get, very soon after this, he finally was tired of making horror films. But luckily, we're just in time. We're just just in there when he's still committed, I think, and Tales from the Crypt benefits from that very much.
Absolutely. Before we close out, I don't think we can talk about the Tales from the Crypt franchise without bringing up the very popular HBO series from the 1990s. I know certainly my generation, when you say Tales from the Crypt, you associate it with this wonderful television show, and of course, the animatronic Crypt Keeper, who's voiced by John Cassier, who's as far away
Yes.
from Ralph Richardson's more conservative portrayal as you can get. Did the creators of the television series ever cite the Amicus films as an influence?
I'd be surprised. I would have thought they would have wanted to get actually quite a long way away from the Amicus
Sure.
way of doing things. 'Cause for a start, we're no longer in Britain. The strange anomaly of these American stories being transplanted to Britain. We're no longer in Britain. We're striking out on our own. And for instance, they didn't they, a very, very extravagant version of the Christmas story in this film, and All Through the House, which is a blast. So yes, I think they will have been wanting to get some distance from them. In between, of course, George Romero and Stephen King had made Creepshow, which was very
Right.
much a Valentine to the EC Comics style. And there they even had they reproduced comic book texts, and they actually tried to make the frames look like comic book frames. I think you get a little bit of that in the Amicus Tales from the Crypt, but it's very, very subtle.
Hmm.
So yes, the subsequent TV series was entirely different. Just before we close, anyway, talking of Ralph Richardson as the Crypt Keeper,
Sure.
one of the confusions of the film, he sort of kids them along that he's warning them about what they might do.
Hmm.
All the way along, he's sort of and yet at the end, it suddenly transpires, no, all this stuff has happened already, and that's why you're here, because if you just pop through that door, you get hell. You've got hell just down that pit there, and we're going to drop you down there. So I think it's off. If you're just watching the film in a cursory way, it can become quite confusing. Have these guys done this stuff yet? At the end, however, watching it again this time, I suddenly realized, at the end, it becomes pretty clear. Yes, this stuff has all happened. They just think. For instance, Major Rogers, who's played so brilliantly by Nigel Patrick. Major Rogers says, "Is this going to take very long? I can't. I've got an appointment." And of course, it turns out the appointment he's referring to is the appointment to start as the head of the blind home. So everything's completely scrambled. What Major Rogers doesn't realise is that he's passed into a kind of zone, hasn't he, into a kind of alternative realm, a limbo. And he thinks he's just on his way to start this job, but in fact, it's all happened already. It's all rather weird and discombobulating. And Ralph Richardson, yes, he's nowhere, he in no way resembles the Crypt Keeper of the comics or indeed the HBO series you mentioned. But was he on that set for more than a day? I very much doubt it. But he just has to sit there under his monk's cowl and just look at everyone in that very penetrating way. And it's a terrible accusatory stare. And you wouldn't want to be in that antechamber with him, would you? No, you wouldn't.
I certainly wouldn't. Now, Jonathan, once again, thank you so much for your time. We certainly appreciate it.
Well, I very much appreciated taking another look at the film. It's a film that I wrote a book many years ago called English Gothic. It was a little bit cool towards the film back then. But one of the beauties of these films, of any films, is that you see a film 25 years ago and you don't much like it, but you never know. 25 years down the line, maybe suddenly you'll like it a lot more. And of course, it can work the other way around too. But in this case, I very much enjoyed seeing Tales from the Crypt again because it's full of lovely stuff. One story which always gets, sorry to go on, but one story which always gets rather ignored because it's much the shortest, I think it's all over within 10 minutes, is the second story, the one with Ian Hendry as the erring husband. And watching that again, I was struck by the way they were making bricks without straw because nothing happens in that story really. It almost literally nothing happens in it. It's just, Guy is leaving his wife and child, goes off with his girlfriend. They're involved in a car crash. He comes back as a zombie. Mm-hmm. That's it. But watching it again, I thought they've got nothing to go on here, but they actually did create from nothing an amazingly strange and atmospheric and very creepy little story. I mean, it's obvious that he's become a zombie. It's no great surprise when you finally see him reflected in that mirrored table. But the actual ambiance of the thing, it's very, very cleverly done. And it's a great example of making something really impressive out of nothing at all. And that impressed me a lot.
Well, that's certainly, I think, a testament to Freddie Francis as a director.
Yes. Exactly. And the whole AMICUS team and the actors, they've got some marvelous actors in for this film. The whole thing. It's a charming film, and I can see why it was the most successful AMICUS portmanteau.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Well, Jonathan, once again, thank you so much. I'm glad you were able to enjoy the film a little bit more this time around.
Well, it happens, and I'm very glad of the opportunity.
If you're in the audience, I hope you'll join us this Monday at 7:30. Jonathan will be returning to introduce a very rare Hammer holiday noir, a wonderful thriller called Cash on Demand, starring one of tonight's stars, Peter Cushing. I hope you'll join us then. Once again, my name is Ryan Bijan. We'll see you next time.